Hey everyone, welcome to the Telsey podcast. I'm Phil Martin from the University of York, and thanks for joining. Today I'm talking with Danny Liu. Danny is Professor of Educational Technologies at the University of Sydney. We're going to talk about assessment and directions that you've been going in at Sydney, which is kind of a response to the response of artificial intelligence or generative AI in higher education. We've seen a lot of chatter around traffic light systems, and you've come up with some alternatives and highlighted some problems there. I first came across you with your webinar for the University of Kent's education series, and that was great. I'll link to that in the show notes. And you've also had a couple of papers out recently, which you've done, I think it's with Thomas Corbin and Philip Dawson. So anyone listening to this who hasn't checked those out yet, do yourselves a favor and click on those in the show notes. Just for anyone who's listening to this but hasn't seen you before or read or listened to anything that you've done, can you give us a brief overview of what you've been working on recently at Sydney and what do these metaphors mean, traffic lights and two-lane approaches?
So my life seems to have been taken over by AI in the last 2.5 years, as I'm sure many people working at universities has as well. So I work as part of a central learning and teaching team, and my role there is to kind of support the university to engage with new ways of thinking around teaching, and obviously AI has been one of the big things. So at Sydney, the metaphor, I guess, that we've adopted is one of driving and driving in one of two lanes. And the idea behind our two-lane metaphor is to say that we need to have assessments which can encourage the safe, supported, scaffolded use of AI, but we also need to have assessments which can actually measure student capability in a trustworthy way. And the assessments that do the measurement, we call those lane one assessments, and the other assessments that kind of encourage students to learn, motivate them to learn, but also engage them in contemporary technologies, we call those lane two assessments. So lane two assessments are, I guess you would call it assessment for learning, and lane one assessments, you would say that they were the assessments of learning. And the whole idea behind those two lanes is really saying that, well, when you drive on the highway, you can't drive between two lanes, you'd crash, right? And so most of our assignments right now, though, are driving between two lanes. We kind of like, oh, you can't really use AI for this, and but we have really no way to stop or detect or restrict students' use of AI. And so what we're doing with the two lanes, saying we need to move assessments into either lane one, where we have supervised assessments where we can, in a trustworthy way, measure student capability, but also we can have lane two assessments where we will say to students, well, there is no way that we can, in reality, ban or block or detect AI. And so you can use AI, but obviously our role as educators is to guide you in how to do that. So that's kind of the metaphor that we're primarily using.
I was interested mainly in the pushback on the traffic light system as well, because I think that, as you point out in your paper and in the webinar, this tends to have dominated discussion so far. And certainly in the UK, I'm not sure, it might be slightly different in Australia. Was your message on this particularly against the grain? And are most unis kind of going with the traffic light system? Or was anything you were saying particularly controversial?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think the traffic light system and other similar systems like the AI assessment scale, they were necessary reactions to the reality of generative AI when it initially came out. They provided these safe harbors where people could kind of say, okay, well, we can define these for our assessments, either a green light, red light, orange light, or we can say this is a level 2 assessment where you're only allowed to use AI for editing, or a level 3 assessment where you only may use AI for drafting or something. And so the reason why we push back against these metaphors around traffic lights and assessment scales is because they're mainly discursive. And what we mean by that is it's basically things you would say to students, and you rely on students following your rules in order to actually then be able to assure assessment validity. But we know that, we know that we can't know for sure that students will follow what we say. And therefore we need more structural changes to assessment, which is what we covered in our recent paper with Thomas Corbin and Philip Dawson. And to say that the traffic light approaches and the assessment scale approaches are are ways that we rely upon students to follow instructions in how they use or do not use AI, and how we tell them whether they can or cannot use AI. But obviously, the reality is we can't do that.
But was this well received in Sydney? I mean, it seems like from your presentation that this is fairly well established now, at least in your department. I mean, was it easy to get buy-in from your department, from the broader uni, and does this approach sit in contrast with other departments in Sydney Uni?
So, because I have the privilege of working in the Central Learning and Teaching division, I guess we get to set strategy for the whole university, and so we have over the last 2 years gradually built awareness around the two-lane approach, and most recently, just a week or two ago, we actually implemented this officially into university policy. And so there has been a gradual, I guess, awareness raising around this, and so it hasn't been an overnight kind of thing. We built the two-lane approach maybe in about July 2023, actually, and we've taken around 2 years to kind of share this around the university, share this around other universities, and kind of build colleagues' comfort with the idea to the extent now that we have it baked into policy.
That's encouraging to know. I mean, when I read your paper, it sort of captured a few of the thoughts that I'd had in the background when I've been sitting listening to the descriptions of traffic light approaches, which seem to have been pretty ubiquitous, really. I've not really encountered anyone who hasn't thought they were amazing ideas, because you get a lot of language around their presentation, which is about empowerment of students. We see words like transparency, dialogue. Is kind of linked into this idea of educators and students working together in a partnership, and so it's couched in very, very positive language. But at bottom, there is a concern about how you'd actually verify anything that is going on, and also when it comes to things like really assessing whether or not we can be sure that students have learned what it is we're talking about. I mean, you opened with the idea of was it a boat driver, someone who stacked into a bridge, which is obviously an extreme example, but it pretty much applies to anything worth assessing, really. We are at a stage where it sounds great, but doesn't actually provide us with any kind of assurances that anyone's doing what the assessments say they're going to do. This seems to have been inextricably linked with AI, but was this a concern before Gen AI sort of exploded onto the scene? Because I'm just thinking, like, with Lane 2 assessments, and let's pick on the essay just as an example, was that ever really secure? I mean, we've been, talking about essay mills and precursors to full-blown Gen AI, like the machine translation technology, questions around authorship for some time now. Is it inextricably linked to Gen AI, or were you thinking about this before?
It's a good question, and I think a bit of both. No assessment ever has been and ever will be 100% secure. I want to start with that. Essays and take-home assessments before Gen AI came around were much more secure than they are now. We've always had contract cheating, always had friends sharing assignments with other friends and those kind of things, and copying and those kind of academic dishonesty approaches. But what generative AI has done is it's made it much easier, faster, cheaper for students to access that kind of assistance, I guess, which we may not want, and which don't allow students to demonstrate their own capabilities. And so I guess what we're seeing with generative AI is a much increased risk in the inability for us to, through a take-home assessment, determine whether students have a particular capability. And that's why we need these supervised Lane 1 assessments in order to actually be able to determine for ourselves, for the society, for the students, for employers, students actually have, we can assure that students have actually demonstrated those capabilities in a secured environment. Now, this is not to say that we need to ignore agency or ignore trust, that we don't trust students anymore and those kind of things. I think it's quite the reverse. A good implementation of the two-lane approach actually improves agency and also improves trust. Because what we're saying with the two-lane approach is, students, you come to us as a university because you want us to help you learn, develop capabilities, and also you need that piece of paper at the end which says you have those capabilities. Now, if we as a university don't have an assessment approach that can actually properly assure the attainment of those capabilities, then your piece of paper is worthless, and employers won't grab you, and students won't come to the university anymore because there is no way to actually, for us to say to this society, this student knows what they're doing. And so in a way, the two-lane approach is 100% about trust that people have in our awards, and trust that students can have in our teaching. But it's also about agency, because it's saying that, in the lane 1 and lane 2 assessments, there are actually a lot of different ways to think about how to assess, and also especially in lane 2, a lot of different ways to think about how assessment activities can run, as well as how AI can be used in them as well. So a lot more choice than people think, not as binary as it seems.
In your position as sort of hub department within the university, I guess you get to work with, you work across the faculties, so you've had responses from everything from the STEM to the humanities. What's been the responses from the departments here, and how have they generally favoured this approach over? I'm talking like there's a binary between the traffic light and the two-lane. Obviously, there's a million different ways in between that we could talk about assessments. How have they responded to this? And is there any departments whose assessment styles are trickier to apply this to than others?
So I want to kind of hang a little bit on that that binary, and I would say that there probably is a binary between the assessment scales and traffic lights and the two-lane approach. I think the assessment scales and traffic lights, they still are discursive in that they rely on students following rules that we set in order to assure integrity. And we know, not because we don't trust students, we should definitely trust students, but we also know that generative AI is everywhere, and it's very tempting to use in ways that are helpful, but also in ways that are unhelpful. And so we can no longer fully rely on that kind of, those take-home unsupervised assessments. So I think there is a binary there. In terms of the faculties, I think there has been a general acceptance, at least at our university and many Australian universities, that we can't restrict or ban or detect generative AI work. And so therefore, systems like the assessment scale and the traffic lights are not, do not serve to make assessments valid. So implementing those systems actually hurts the validity of assessments, because we're no longer measuring what we think we're measuring through assessments if we implement those traffic lights and assessment scales. And so the faculty response has been, I think, one of slow acceptance, and it's been fairly even across the different kinds of faculties. You'd assume that, humanities, for example, might be more against it or those kind of things. But I think every faculty that we've talked to discipline-wise, they recognize the need to actually confirm capability, and the confirmation of capability needs to come through some kind of supervised assessment.
Would it be, I was just thinking what form the pushback might take, and I think just from recent experience, the idea of having to redesign, assess, because you're talking about structural changes. Discursive changes are kind of easier to make, although, and as you say in your paper, I mean, they do give having that front sheet gives you a sense of security, and it gives you a sense of control, whereas making structural changes and kind of like uprooting your existing assessments and kind of changing them around, I'm sure there are things you can keep, but there are structural changes can get quite messy. So how have you addressed concerns around just general workload and guidance of how you'd make these structural changes? Because presumably the subject matter experts in these departments would need some kind of guidance from people like yourself. So presumably there must be a strain on your time as well to go around working with these SMEs to talk about ways in which they could make these structural changes in a way that's kind of manageable with their time and kind of does what it says on the tin. So how's that experience been, and how have you managed it?
Hmm. So I guess there would be, and there has been pushback about why are we even doing this? Why is it necessary? Why can't we just implement traffic lights and tell students not to use AI? But I think
Mm.
over slowly over time, especially in the last 6 to 12 months, we've seen an acceptance that we actually can't. People have come to terms with that the fact that we can't use these discursive approaches. We can't just say to students, don't use AI or only use AI for this or only use AI for this. And so the 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 driver against the pushback, well, I guess the motivation of academics is really that we still really need to assure the value of our award programs. And for me, value in the generative AI kind of space hinges on two things. One is integrity, and the other one is relevance. The value of integrity comes from, do we know that the graduate walking across the graduation stage knows what they need to know and can do what they need to do? And
Mm.
relevance is, do we know that the graduate actually has developed the skills and the capabilities they need to engage with this modern world? And so I think academics are deeply invested in value, and that's helped to kind of motivate some of this change. Now, the actual operationalization has been obviously complex, and we're still going through it right now. We're not at
Yeah.
the end, nowhere near the end. But what it has involved is us setting up policy, setting up curriculum management system structures to allow a recategorization, I guess, of assessments into lane 1 and lane 2 assessment categories and types, and there's many of them. And then providing support to program teams to start thinking about that redesign process. Where are our current assurance gaps and how do we plug them? Where are we over assessing, under assessing? Which learning outcomes are we not assessing, over assessing? And therefore, how do we kind of redesign around that?
Yeah, so it's because my own thought was when I think about what's going to be easier to manage in the long run, the issues I could see with the traffic light system. I'm just thinking about my own teaching here as well. It would be just the sheer complexity of unpicking what constitutes false authorship, what constitutes, we will insert words like over reliance. That's a sort of verbal line that we'd introduce, but that's going to end up being arbitrary. How would you prevent just a slew of academic misconduct cases being put up the line, which are very patchy in terms of they're based on individual teachers' impressions. So I could see that getting very messy and getting workload heavy. But so that would be, I'm kind of sold myself, but I could imagine there would be quite a lot of resistance from certain quarters when you start talking about structural changes. So that's it's interesting to hear that this is a big project. In your presentation, it looked, I mean this in a positive way, you made it look really simple. It sounded like everything was kind of like smooth and up and running. And I guess a kind of tag-on question to that is where we're dealing with observed assessments, have you found that they inherently are more resource intensive than marking async work like essays?
Good questions. I think you're right about the slew of misconduct cases that are incoming, and it's also the unfairness of those cases. Like, a student who uses AI really well, or a student who can afford new modern AIs, they're going to escape detection much better, much more than a student who is either trying
absolutely
AI itself. And so there's a big equity gap there in terms of issue there when it comes to actually picking up the use and the kind of false authorship that you mentioned before. In terms of just, I guess, from the student perspective, it's all just really confusing. Like, all the surveys coming around across the world from students, basically, they are confused. They're confused because everyone says different things. Some people say you can use it for this, you can't use it for this. And so there's massive confusion in the student ranks. And I think what the two-lane approach does is it gives students clarity. It gives students clarity in terms of, these are going to be the observed lane 1 assessments. This is where we're going to make it so that the community can trust your degree. And we're going to have other assessments where we're going to basically say, yes, you can use AI in ways that you want to do, but our job as teachers is to kind of help you navigate that kind of complex landscape and use AI well. Has it been a smooth process? Definitely not. As much as a presentation might lead you to think about that. And I think that it's been a journey of bringing on board or alongside our academics to kind of appreciate and grow awareness around generative AI's capabilities and also about what students are saying and what they're doing. But in terms of the resource intensity, it's an interesting question because observed assessments are usually higher workload because you need invigilation or supervision, you need training around that, you need to have the spaces where you can run these and everything. And so most of the time, it is higher workload, which is why we're saying to people for these lane one assessments, don't have them in every module, have them at the program level. So you might have it every 2 modules or every 3 modules or every year or something. And so you're kind of taking the secure assessments out of the individual modules and putting it at a program level so that you save work. And also it means that you can actually have a more holistic picture of what's happening across your modules. There are some secure assessments which actually end up being less work. I'll give you an example, interactive orals. So an interactive oral assessment, for those who don't know, is a kind of a conversational assessment where you have a strong rubric. It's not an oral exam. And an interactive oral allows you to basically, through a scenario, explore what a student knows. They can synthesize and extend what they know and basically express this to you verbally. And what I found through running my own interactive orals is that I have a lot more fun listening to a student or talking with a student for 15 minutes and then spending 5 minutes writing up some feedback and pressing submit than I do reading a 4,000 word essay, which they may not have written anyway. And then that takes me about half an hour at least, or 40 minutes. And so I save a lot more time, have a lot more fun, and actually get to know what my students know or don't know much deeper.
Yeah, I think you give a few examples in one of the papers that you've got there of the kinds of lane one assessments that you use. So we've got interactive orals and observed that. I think they were the kind of the biggest response that I've seen to, if in doubt, put an interactive oral in there. Are there any other kind of common or perhaps underutilized lane one type assessments that you found have worked really well?
Yeah, so we have, and we might put this in the show notes too, if that's okay. We have an AI for Educators site. I'm just pulling it up now to refresh my own memory.
Is that the Canvas
Yes, that's
site?
the Canvas site, yeah.
Yeah, I've got that. Yeah, I'll definitely stick that in. That's great.
Yeah, and so we have, for lane one assessments, we have 13 different types of lane one assessments, and lane two, we have 16 different types of lane two assessments. And so some of the more underutilized lane one assessments are things like maybe an in-person task or performance or demonstration that you observe the student doing. It's good for kind of like skills-based modules. You have things like in-person creative tasks or in-person written tasks where you might sit students down for 20 minutes in a tutorial and get them to write something in front of you. You could have a Q&A, which is, a student might present a presentation. That presentation could be completely AI generated plus the script, but then you have a 5-10 minute Q&A with the students after the presentation to kind of say, well, why did you do this? What did you think about this? What if this happened? What happened then? So that really digs into what they know or they don't know. So there are different ways of doing secure assessments.
So on that point, just how do you respond if you've got a student who you get to the Q&A bit where that's where you really try to dig into what they know, and your responses still sound scripted, so they're not giving the kind of answers you're looking for. They're kind of rehashing bits that they prepped. How do you treat responses like that?
So in those situations, in all situations for these kinds of assessments, you would need to have a strong rubric that will have lots of different criteria, lots of different standards. And what you would do is you would try and move your student through that rubric. Like you wouldn't tell them I'm on rubric column 2 and row 5. You say, what if this happened? Can you kind of analyze what would happen then? And if they really can't do it, then at least that conversational nature of that assessment allows you to say, okay, well, let's take a step back and think about it some other way. And that way it actually helps you to dig into what they know. And you'd be surprised through these oral assessments how flexible you can actually be with students and how much you can actually dig into what they do and don't know.
I wanted to jump across to lane 2 because I think you said quite clearly in your presentation and in your articles about how these are really valuable. We don't want to get rid of them, and I think anyone who's gone through the process of writing knows how it can shape your thinking, and it's possibly one of the most valuable things you can do as part of an education process is to just take time and formulate your own responses in asynchronously. How have you seen, when you've moved all these into Lane 2, so we're treating them as more like formative pieces of work, have you seen engagement with these drop off, or do students still kind of complete them as intended?
It's an interesting question because it makes us think about what the purpose of assessment is. And I think there's a number of different purposes of assessment. There's assessment that measures capability, and there's assessment that motivates learning. There's assessment that enables feedback to be provided to students, and a whole bunch of different reasons to have assessments. I think some of the important purposes of Lane 2 assessments are for enabling feedback and kind of students to apply their knowledge and therefore be able to get the feedback and get the practice, but also is there to kind of motivate learning, because students will know that they have a Lane 1 assessment coming up, so they actually better develop those capabilities that will be measured, and so they use the Lane 2 to kind of encourage, motivate, and steer them towards developing those things. And so we still put marks towards Lane 2 assessments, and that not guarantees, but that will see students engaging with those Lane 2 assessments still. And if you structure your curriculum in a way that students can see the progression from a Lane 2 assessment into a secure Lane 1 assessment, then that will be a motivator to say, well, I better engage now, because if I don't learn here, I'm not going to be able to pass that Lane 1.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, because I notice the kind of number of students who submit drafts tends to be pretty low. And I'm actually, a quick question I did have as well. Only from your presentation, I wasn't quite clear if you're treating the Lane 2 assessments as purely formative, or do they contribute just a small amount to are they a minor contribution to the overall summative mark?
I personally try and avoid the words formative and summative, because I find that everyone I talk to has a different meaning of that in their heads. Some people think summative means counts for marks. Some people think formative doesn't count for marks. Some people think formative does count for marks, but it's actually developmental, and vice versa. So I like to think about it as Lane 1 and Lane 2 assessments both count for marks. We usually think about marks in terms of effort. So if a student is expected to make a presentation or a video or do a case study analysis, that's a lot of effort the student needs to go through. And so we would put that fairly high in terms of marks to kind of encourage student effort. We would then have maybe a secure Lane 1 assessment, which may be only 30% of the final mark. But this is actually the case in one of my own modules that I teach into. So we have 70% coming from Lane 2, and we have 30% coming from the Lane 1. But for us, the Lane 1 is also a must-pass hurdle assessment, which means that the student fails that Lane 1, they fail the whole module.
There was another thing, which you didn't mention this in your and any of your work that I've read so far, but one word that kind of an objection that I've had to things like closed exams, which we haven't touched on, but feel free to comment on, but is the word authenticity. I'm hearing this a lot, and I've been involved in several kind of lengthy discussions with people about why authenticity does not equal validity. And authenticity in assessment is fantastic, and it's getting your tasks to be as authentic as possible and giving students transferable skills is all to be lauded. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you're measuring if anything, my take on this was that authenticity can get in the way of assessment because you're adding too many variables. This is an analogy I've not aired before, but are you thinking about, if you're measuring how fast someone can run, the way the 100-meter sprint is set up at track and field is a good way of doing it. It's not very authentic because nobody actually runs like that in a straight line with no obstacles. But we wouldn't ever say, well, let's have them running for a bus or, being late for the school pickup, because it would be authentic, but it wouldn't be getting to the crux of the issue of who is actually the fastest runner. But it's not a point I've been able to make very successfully. He always keeps coming back to the fact that authentic assessments, as in getting students out there in unseen conditions and doing something which we're not quite sure about, is what we should be pursuing, and that kind of sweeps aside conversations about validity. So, have you had any similar conversations along those lines, or does any of that chime with what you've been thinking about?
Yeah, the 100-meter sprint is an interesting thing. It seems a bit like a reductionist approach to assessment, perhaps. It's saying that, that particular thing is just, we're going to measure this one particular capability in this one particular way. And I guess that is one way to think about it. When I think about authenticity and assessment, I think about authenticity in terms of a motivator for activity. So if you design an authentic assessment, either an authentic lane 1 or authentic lane 2, it's the main purpose of the authenticity is to kind of engage students in learning, because they'll think, oh, this is an interesting case study. It's probably what I'm going to be seeing when I graduate. Therefore, I'm going to pay more attention because it's more relevant to me, versus, oh, it's a multiple choice exam. I hate these and I'm not going to engage. So authenticity, I think, drives engagement and motivation, but it doesn't drive validity. Like you said, there have been lots of papers out that basically say, authenticity does not protect against contract cheating, doesn't protect against GNAI, definitely doesn't protect against, it doesn't ensure validity, like you said. So I think there are assessments that we can put in place that can be authentic and can be complex. And interactive oral is not, like, just going back to that again, it's an interesting example because we have conversations all the time. We're having a conversation right now. A conversation happens all the time as part of work, as part of life and society, living in society. And so it's a really genuine way to actually see what a student can do and how they think and things. And a conversation can be really rich and complex and exploratory and deep and wide. And it doesn't need to necessarily be reductionist in a way, but it does require a well-trained assessor who's an expert in the field to be able to evaluate that performance.
Yeah, I mean, I think the 100-meter dash is a bit to make the point, but I'm not. I guess when we look at the learning outcomes of a modular program, they tend to be more complex than running as fast as you can. So I think even when you're looking at trying to measure understanding something, it can get very messy. But you still, I mean, the point is you want to hone in on a particular variable. And I guess there could be some situations, especially, I don't know, I don't want to single out particular modules or disciplines, but where, for example, closed exams, it just is the best way of isolating that variable and measuring what you want to measure. And I think we've, certainly in the UK, I mean, I'm interested in how different this is in the Australian context, but there's been an almost unanimous kind of pushback against closed exams, and it's a kind of COVID legacy, but most of the kind of conferences, the events and things that I've been to around the UK are very, very wary, some for really good reasons about accessibility and student coping and the impact on students. I totally understand that, but this is very difficult to make the case for closed exams, even when that might be the best way of capturing the variable that you want to capture. So what's the mood around closed exams in Sydney and Australia generally? If that's even fair, I know in your paper you talk about a lot of countries, and it's not like there's an Australian way of doing things in the UK, but just...
It's a fair question. I think in the Australian context, there's a variety, as you would expect. There are universities who have essentially said no more closed book exams, and there are universities who are kind of running back in a way to closed book exams because, like you say, they see that as one way to actually be able to measure reliably that capability. And so my personal view is that exams have a place as part of a balanced, secure assessment diet, but it needs to be just one of many forms.
So do you have exams? I take it you do have exams running as part of a lane.
Yeah, we do. That's right. And in a way, the fact that we have lane ones as part of the choices helps academics to be more comfortable with the lane because they say, well, I'm familiar with exams, and so it's something that I can actually engage with. And then that kind of allows us to open a conversation to say, well, have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? Have you thought about what your learning outcome is and how else you could be assessing that?
So what's the uptake on this generally? So I asked a little bit earlier about the the ubiquity of the traffic light system around kind of conversational circles that you've had. It seems like your ideas have been really well received. I've seen your papers got a huge number of views and it's been widely shared. What's been your feedback like? Has it been positive, and have you seen what you're doing being adopted by other institutions?
So I think we are seeing a gradual recognition that more discursive approaches like traffic lights and assessment scales don't actually work, especially for assessment of learning. And assessment of learning is one part of what we need to do as institutions. We also need to have assessment for learning, obviously, but assessment of learning is really key. And so we have seen a lot of Australian institutions and institutions around the world are starting to kind of adopt the two-lane approach, or similar. They might call it two-track or two-channel or something, but it's basically two. It's the fact that you have the observed, supervised in-person assessments where you can measure capability, and then you have the others where you engage students in AI use and thoughtfully and those kind of things. There has been a fair bit of uptake just because now 2.5 years on, people are saying, oh, okay, I see where reality is right now. We better get moving.
One of the questions I was going to ask earlier, which I'll just stick on at the end here, was you said you've been taken over a bit by AI recently, as many of us kind of feel in the same way. I mean, what about with regards to assessment? Is this something that is a long-standing interest of yours, or is it something that's kind of you've been drawn into since ChatGPT made itself on the scenes?
I think it's one of those. So my day job is an academic developer, and so my bread and butter is to help academics think through their learning designs, their curriculum, how they teach, the pedagogy, the strategies, and those kind of things. And assessment forms a necessary part of that. So assessment's always been kind of bubbling in the background as one of the things that I addressed fairly regularly as part of my work. But AI obviously has brought that much more to the fore. Especially in terms of that value proposition that we have as universities to be able to have the integrity as well as the relevance angle and how we can actually promote that through assessment as well.
So what are you working on next? Is there a new paper, or is it just time, a precious commodity which is slipping away?
Yeah, it's a bit of that. So we are working at Sydney over the next kind of year and a half quite closely with academics to hit the redesign angle of things. And so encouraging people to think beyond module towards kind of the program level way of thinking. We know that for very complex degrees, we just won't be able to do that. And so we are helping people to think within their modules what they can do in terms of secure and open lane 2 assessments. We also have other things at play in AI, for example, building platforms that allow teachers to build their own custom AIs and kind of explore the possibilities around AI use within learning, teaching, and assessment there. And generally just kind of helping us and also other universities and schools think through kind of AI adoption strategies and how to do it in a very human, thoughtful way.
Brilliant. Okay, right. Well, Danny, I appreciate we're approaching midnight where you are, so this has been fantastic. Thank you. I'll, as I say, I'll link to your works as they are so far, and I've recently discovered you on LinkedIn. Fascinating person to follow. Just the shares that you put out are invariably interesting and worth reading. So I'll put your LinkedIn handle down there so people can follow you and see what you're up to. But yeah, just to say thanks again for your time. It's been really educational, and I look forward to seeing more of what you're up to in the future.
Thanks so much, Phil. And it's great to share. I think the thing that has really struck me about this whole last 2 to 3 years has been how open people are. And how we're all learning together. I don't have all the answers. We're still along the journey, and the more that we all talk to each other, the better we will be for it. So thank you for this.
Nice one. Great. Okay, all the best, Danny. Thanks again.
Thanks, Phil.
Cheers.